Hi, everybody. I'm Brittany Lewis, a breaking news reporter here at Forbes. Joining me now is Forbes contributor Ben Koltun. Ben, I appreciate you coming back on.
Thanks, Brittany, for having me.
I want to talk with you about the latest when it comes to the debt ceiling negotiations. House Republicans just this week passed the Limit, Save, Grow Act of 2023. First, before we begin, can you break down what is in the bill?
Sure. So House Speaker Kevin McCarthy, working with his leadership team and a lot of different members of the Republican caucus, passed the Limit, Save, Grow Act. Now, this raises the debt ceiling by about 1.5 trillion, or extending it until the end of March of next year. And in return for that, they have about $4.8 trillion in cuts to the deficit over the next decade. Now, a bulk of that is on discretionary spending. So that means that for fiscal year 2024, which begins in October of this year, they're calling for a decrease of spending to fiscal year 2022 levels. And then from there, they want to cap spending for each year at 1%. Now, beyond that, there's a lot of other kind of grab bag priorities for Republicans in this bill. This includes work requirements for Medicaid and stronger work requirements for programs like food stamps and other welfare benefits. It includes their primary energy legislation, H.R. 1, which includes things like permitting reform. They want to try to reduce regulations and require that Congress has a say on major regulations. And they also have a repeal of President Biden's student loan debt relief executive actions. And then the final thing is they are trying to repeal many elements of the Democrats' Inflation Reduction Act, particularly some of the clean energy provisions. So this is kind of what's in this pretty substantial package to help raise the debt ceiling and get the votes from Republicans in the House.
This just squeaked by in the House. Republicans voted for it. Not a single Democrat voted for this. 4 Republicans actually voted with Democrats against this. But Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer did not mince words and said this bill was dead on arrival when it gets to the Senate. And some Democrats even went so far as to say this was basically a ransom note from the GOP. So where do negotiations go from here?
Yes, there seems to be an intractable impasse right now in the debt ceiling negotiations. House Republicans, with passing the Limit, Save, Grow Act, are saying there's no legislation, there's no clean debt ceiling bill that could pass the House. Democrats, meanwhile, are saying there's only a clean debt ceiling bill is the only thing that can pass the House. And then the White House is publicly shooting down any executive actions that can be taken on the debt ceiling. So from kind of bird's eye view, it seems like things are at an impasse. But it's a positive development, I think, that we saw for McCarthy being able to cobble together a slim majority to pass something, because this moves the process forward. And in many things in Washington, D.C., a lot of times there are public fights, but then there's a catalyst to get them to really talk and try to negotiate. And so this is one catalyst that puts the ball in the Democrats' court. And while Democrats are currently saying, no, we are not going to negotiate over the debt ceiling, there will be some further talks. And I think that's a positive development. And the goal for any negotiated outcome on the debt ceiling is for both sides to be able to declare victory. And that's still very much TBD on whether that can happen. But the goal here is that President Biden and Democrats are talking about a budget deal with an ancillary add of the debt ceiling, whereas Republicans are trying to come up with a debt ceiling deal with an ancillary add of the budget. And whether these two sides can come together and find a way to kind of bridge the bid-ask spread right now, which is pretty vast. It's still up in the air, but this moves the process forward, I think, for people in Wall Street and people in DC, just to watch how these dynamics unfold moving forward as the X date nears.
I think the word impasse is the perfect way to describe this, and I want to talk about specific key players in these negotiations by name. So let's talk about what they're doing. President Joe Biden, Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries, and Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell. As we know, Kevin McCarthy was able to pass that bill through the House. Is he the only one that has proven to be able to get some sort of tangible action when it comes to debt ceiling negotiations?
He is. And I think that's to the credit of McCarthy, is that he can credibly say he is the only person who has the votes or has the support or has the path to take action on the debt ceiling. President Biden, so far in his administration, so far said that they are unwilling to take executive action. Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer doesn't have the votes for a clean increase in the debt ceiling in the Senate, which requires 60 votes. So McCarthy does have a rhetorical tool at play here. Now, that, of course, isn't going to mean what was passed in the House is ultimately be able to what's going to pass the Senate and what could be signed by President Biden. And this becomes the biggest challenge for McCarthy moving forward, is that the coalition that he put together to pass the Limit, Save, Grow Act is going to be different than the coalition that he puts together to pass anything that can pass the Senate or pass the White House. And at that time, he's going to have pressure from his right flank that we saw in the speakership fight earlier in this year to not kind of make any concessions or just to win a fight. And so there's going to be a lot of pressure on him to try to figure out how he can negotiate a deal while keeping his job as speaker. But then on the other side, the Democratic side, they've been through many of these fights before. Biden was there in 2011 with the debt ceiling crisis, so was Chuck Schumer, and they've learned a lesson that they don't want to negotiate, which they see this as hostage taking. But the challenge here is that Biden has just announced his push for re-election, and they don't want to have a recession, which could be the case with a debt ceiling default. And so it's kind of taking kind of the two ends of the coin, whether, don't negotiate, but if you don't negotiate, you could have a recession. Most voters don't really care about the ins and outs of these debt ceiling fights, but they do care about a default and the impact on the economy and the impact on jobs. So I think for Biden and Schumer, they're looking for a way to come up with a deal that avoids a default, but also lets them say, look, we negotiated something, but we did not take this hostage taken seriously. So we won some concessions on the budget or some other things. And so this is kind of a tiptoe for them of how to get involved in the talks without feeling like they are being held for ransom. And then there's Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell. He has been involved in debt ceiling talks in the past, but he has made abundantly clear that he supports the talks between the White House and McCarthy. And while McConnell was someone who was involved in talks in the past, he knows that he really doesn't have the power to come with a deal for something that can then pass the more conservative House. And so he's just trying to take a back seat, and he's not quite yet dipping his oar in the water, although that is something that could happen if talks break down and there is a real desire, at least by some moderate Republicans or some Senate Republicans, to reach a deal with Biden.
You bring up a good point, and you and I talked about debt ceiling negotiations back in January, and you made the point that this is kind of a boring conversation, debt ceiling, but then when it gets to this, the theatrics of it all, that's when people really care, because no one wants to default on our debt. When people hear the word recession, they immediately, obviously that is worst case scenario. So this also comes in the backdrop of a presidential election getting just underway. So politically, right now, who do you see the winners and losers in this fight?
Well, this week, McCarthy is the winner. I think that he proved a lot of naysayers wrong of that. He can navigate the thin margins and kind of the unwieldy nature of some conservatives and put together an increase in the debt ceiling, put together a package and get it passed. But I think the bigger test is to come. And right now, Biden, his goal for running for re-election, he has kind of one saying: don't compare me to the almighty, compare me to the alternative. And what does that mean? It's that people may not love Biden, but they don't hate him. And they're really kind of off-put. A lot of kind of swing voters, a lot of independent voters in suburbs, they're off-put by some perceived extremism on the side of Republicans. Now, whether that's kind of Trumpism, whether that's actions on restricting abortion, all these other things that a majority of Americans take pause in. And so what Biden and Democrats are trying to do is they're trying to tie that kind of perceived extremism with the debt ceiling. They're saying the legislation that Republicans pass will have draconian cuts to things like veterans care, for some support for young families, for healthcare, and for other areas like that. The problem, as we mentioned, is that a lot of voters just aren't tuning into this stuff, besides kind of the diehard partisans. And so I think sometimes there's an echo chamber here for Democrats and Republicans on what really matters and versus what really matters to kind of their most diehard supporters. And so I think all eyes are going to be on Democrats. Can Biden and Democrats come up with a reasonable counter proposal that doesn't make them seem like they're the ones that are blocking an increase in the debt ceiling? Because most voters, they have qualms about the debt ceiling. They have qualms about kind of big spending. And what Republicans have put forward is a proposal. But there's going to come a time when the X date nears, where there's more market dislocations besides just in treasury yields and credit default swaps that can really get the attention of your everyday voter who isn't tuning in to kind of the ins and outs of this kind of debt ceiling impasse. And when that comes, who are they going to blame? Some of them will blame Biden. Some of them will blame Republicans, but they're going to blame the people in power. And that's a challenge for Biden, who's going to be running against a Republican who, whether that's former President Trump, whether that's Governor Ron DeSantis, whether that's someone else who isn't front and center in these debt ceiling talks and can say, the dysfunction of DC, the dysfunction of things, that needs a new change. And I think then the pressure becomes on Biden to really show that he can actually deliver some sort of negotiation, some sort of deal that leaves him seen like a reasonable alternative than any of kind of the Republicans running for president.
From what you're saying, it sounds like it's Democrats' turn to come to the table. And you mentioned diehard partisans, but I do want to talk about two moderates. One, Congressman Brian Fitzpatrick, a Republican from Pennsylvania, and the second is Congressman Josh Gottheimer, who is a Democrat from New Jersey. Both in January were working on a proposal about the debt ceiling. And Brian Fitzpatrick said this week that there needs to be a, quote, two-party solution when it comes to this. What do you think that looks like?
So the House Problem Solvers Caucus, which both Fitzpatrick and Gottheimer co-chair, quietly released a proposal that had the support of a supermajority of their 64 members the same day that McCarthy released the Limit, Save, Grow Act. And what this proposal said was that Congress will suspend the debt ceiling through the end of the year, and it will be suspended again until 2025 if there are certain conditions met. Those conditions include creating a bipartisan fiscal commission to look at spending and ways to reduce the deficit. And it would also try to take some measures on appropriations for fiscal year 2024 and maybe fiscal year 2025. And if those conditions were met, there would be another suspension of the debt ceiling. And what Fitzpatrick was saying, and Fitzpatrick is someone who voted for the Limit, Save, Grow Act, is that in reality, any deal that passes the House, the Republican House, passes the Democratic Senate, and is signed by a Democratic president, needs to be bipartisan. And so we were talking a lot about how Republicans are working amongst themselves and how the hardline House Freedom Caucus has a lot more power. But the real power to create some of these deals is in that small centrist middle that really determines control of the House and the Senate and the White House, for that matter, in each election cycle. And so Fitzpatrick is one of 18 Republicans in the House who reside in districts that were won by Joe Biden in 2020. They have different dynamics and incentives than the Chip Roys or the Matt Gaetzes of the world, or most Republicans who fear most a primary rather than a general election for their political viability. And so what we're seeing with this bipartisan proposal is that when two sides are kind of at an impasse, some third option comes in and they say, look, you may not like this, but the other side doesn't like it as well. And so just come to the table, make some sacrifices, and we can kind of carry the political brunt of this. And we've seen some mileage in the past few years from groups like the Problem Solvers Caucus. There was a COVID aid package in late 2020 that they were able to get through. And then 2021, it was the infrastructure legislation that they were able to push through when leadership on both sides weren't able to come to a deal. And so this is going to be an important faction to watch moving forward as we try to get into kind of the more negotiation stage of the debt ceiling process and the power that they have in trying to craft a deal and cajoling leadership on both sides to try to find a way out.
As of now, there is no solution. We will definitely keep an eye out on those moderates, but Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen said defaulting on our debt would be an economic and financial catastrophe. So first, when is this dreaded X date? When's the drop dead date this needs to be resolved by?
Well, it's something that we can get more clarity on in the days and weeks ahead. There's nothing that kind of gets Congress, Washington D.C. to act like a definitive deadline, and the X date is certainly a definitive deadline. But we were waiting for kind of the tax season in April and seeing what the tax receipts were like and the number of refunds. And at least from some analysts, it's that it was a bit weaker than expected, the number of kind of the tax revenue that we received. And so there were some concerns that this could happen the X date where there's no more money to pay the obligations in early June. But right now, I think the Treasury is going to release something in the next day or so. Some independent analysts, the Congressional Budget Office and the Bipartisan Policy Center have said that they will release their revised estimates in May, in the early May. And so we're going to get a more definitive date here. And right now, the idea and the consequences of default remain largely theoretical. But when you have a specific deadline, a specific date, or at least a more narrow range, it really does create an impetus in Congress to start talking or to start kind of maneuvering beyond kind of the public sniping that's going on right now. Because right now, you do see a lot of market dislocation, that you see kind of 3-year treasuries have a much higher rate, which is kind of an estimate X date of around July, than you see with 1-month treasuries. And you're seeing kind of credit default swap levels, premiums at a very high level. And so you're seeing kind of the initial whispers or warning signs from the market, but that's still not really cajoling Congress. And I think once you get that X date, and once you actually see like public markets becoming more active or more agitated, then I think you start to see a lot more talks going on.
A default is obviously worst case scenario, but what are the other potential and probable outcomes here?
Yes. So I think one of the reasons why there is some nerves about what's going on is that there's a lack of clarity about the means of taking action on the debt ceiling, even if there's confidence that the U.S. avoids a default in the end. So there's 4 ways to take action on the debt ceiling. There's executive action. There's a negotiated solution between Republicans and Democrats. There is a way to bypass House Republicans in the Congress. And then there's a way just to put legislation on the floor in Congress, and what's colloquially said, vote no, but hope yes. And so right now, after House Republicans pass the Limit Save Grow Act, a lot of focus is on a negotiated route. And so we're going to see McCarthy talk with Biden and Schumer and see if there's something that can go on. But if we get to that point where like negotiations aren't going anywhere, the X date is nearing, we're going to revolve around these other options. So you're going to hear more talk about internal deliberation within the White House and the Treasury of whether there can be executive action taken to remove kind of the debt ceiling factor. There's going to be talk about something called a discharge petition, which is a way to kind of bypass House leadership and bring legislation to the floor if some House Republican moderates feel like McCarthy isn't able to deliver the votes. And then you could hear some things that say that McCarthy will bring something to the floor but not vote for it, and just hope that doing that it will raise the debt ceiling, but it won't endanger his job with something like a motion to vacate by Republicans. And so right now the focus is on negotiations, but it's important just to be aware of these other options as the negotiations move forward, and whether they prove successful or whether they prove to be a failure, and what those options can mean, and kind of the timing for that as the X date nears.
Let's say negotiations falter and they have to go to one of those other options. Is that a political loss for a specific person or party, or do voters really care how this gets done as long as it gets done and we don't default on our debt?
I don't think anyone has lost an election based on the debt ceiling. As much as people in DC malign it and say this is like an existential threat and this is the biggest political fight ever, it's hard for me to see that in 2023, which is still more than a year out from the election, that this will make a difference. But it does make a difference for someone like Kevin McCarthy if he can't be at the negotiating table. I think it is a little remarkable that between McCarthy and Biden, the two don't really talk much with each other. They don't have much of a relationship, but they have a lot in common. And one thing is that they're both perennially underestimated. And that's the case in DC for Biden, as it is for McCarthy, and how long he can be speaker. And another thing is that neither are really ideological people. Now, in a world where you could come to a deal with raising the debt ceiling and you wouldn't have any blowback from the base, both McCarthy and Biden would take that deal in a heartbeat. But the problem is that the rank and file from both sides want to fight as much as they want a negotiated outcome. And so if there is a situation where McCarthy just can't deliver the votes on his side, or he feels like there's career risk if he kind of creates too many concessions, it's going to be a big blow to his credibility as a leader if you have to do something like a discharge petition or bypass the traditional norms of legislating. And we saw a former speaker, John Boehner, kind of lose his power from failed debt ceiling negotiations. And so I believe that if politically this doesn't make a difference on the composition of the House, Senate, and White House in the 2024 election, if you don't come up with a negotiated solution, but you come up with something to raise the debt ceiling, it would be politically disastrous, I'd say, for someone like Kevin McCarthy.
A lot hinges on this for Kevin McCarthy, especially because he saw his speakership really hang in the balance there just a few months ago. And Ben, as this plays out, I hope you come back on and share your insights with us. Ben Koltun, thanks for joining me.
Thanks, Brittany.